Normally, when we talk about the Civil War, we talk about each side as being all of one thing or all of the other. A struggle between North and South, central versus state governments, abolition versus institutional slavery, however you'd like to put it. But it's a bit more complicated, and you couldn't just expect to see all Unionists in a Union state like Missouri, and then swim across the Mississippi River over into Tennessee and find all Confederates there. There were many Unionists in the South, and there were many Confederates in the North, everywhere, from state to state, from county to county, and on smaller scales than that, people have all sorts of different interests and ideologies. And one of the areas in the Civil War where this sort of contrast, or maybe gray area, was best seen was in the border states. These states, though officially siding with the Union, and were and remained in the Union all throughout the war, were basically teetering on the very edge of secession all the while, with Abraham Lincoln constantly trying to appease them and the Confederate president, Jeff Davis, trying to win them over. For Lincoln, losing even one of these states might mean the death of the Union, already tattered. For Davis, winning these states similarly might help decide whether or not the Confederacy would survive the war. These states are Delaware, Maryland, West Virginia, Kentucky, and Missouri, all slave states, the only slave states to have stayed in the Union. So why, if these states were not all for the Union, why weren't they all for the Confederacy? All the other southern states seemed to be for one thing, and all the other northern states seemed to be all for the other thing. Why were these states so uncertain? Well, let's lay it out in 4 segments: the history of the region, the military importance of the region, the effects of the war on this region, and lastly, Reconstruction. 3 of these states were part of the original 13 colonies, if you count West Virginia, which wasn't separated from the rest of Virginia until 1863, over halfway through the Civil War. In 1792 and 1821, respectively, Kentucky and Missouri entered the Union. These 2 border states were probably the most divided and the most important. Judging by the 1850 and 1860 censuses, these states were also some of the fastest growing states in the Union, and that's for good reason. Southerners sent their children to these states for college and better paying jobs. Northerners sent theirs south for more land at good prices, and those on the East Coast sent their sons to these states because this was the frontier, with all new opportunities, more than you would ever see on the young but aging East Coast. Kentucky produced some of the most important and influential leaders in the lead up to the Civil War. They had Henry Clay, Cassius Clay, Vice President and then Confederate John Breckinridge, Zachary Taylor, and both Jefferson Davis and Abe Lincoln. These inner divisions in these states, and mainly Kentucky, was really representative of the divisions of the nation as a whole. Deeply divided, just maybe on a smaller scale. These states were one of the few places where all different types of people of different ideologies and interests met, of all different parties and positions in life. And it is where a lot of the lead up to the war happened, like the Missouri Compromise. And it also had a very central role in both the controversial Dred Scott decision and the Bleeding Kansas conflict. When the 1860 election came around, not one of these border states voted for Lincoln. But they didn't all vote for one party. Kentucky and Virginia voted for John Bell and the Constitutional Union Party. Missouri was the only state besides a few of New Jersey's delegates to vote for the Democratic Party. Delaware and Maryland both voted for Vice President John Breckinridge and his Southern Democratic Party. Soon after the 1860 election, 7 states seceded. And then there was an attack on Fort Sumter, and 4 states more followed. Kentucky, along with Missouri, was one of the few states to declare neutrality, which many pro-Unionists said was practically just letting the Confederacy destroy the Union while sitting back and watching. And Confederates said practically the same thing, that Kentucky was just standing by while the Union was destroying their liberties. In spite of the official neutrality, Kentucky also technically kinda seceded, and I mean very technically. It had representatives in the Confederate government and everything, but it also had representatives in the U.S. Senate and House of Representatives. Missouri did a similar thing when Missouri's governor, Claiborne Jackson, held a special election to decide whether or not Missouri would secede. Jackson was hoping that this election would turn out in a pro-Confederate way, but they did not. Shortly after this, Jackson decided that he and his cabinet, as well as a number of representatives in the state House of Representatives, would secede, against the wishes of the people of the state. This attempt failed, and Jackson was almost immediately replaced. Nevertheless, Jackson went on and made sure to keep fighting for the Confederacy, and in November of 1861, they were admitted as a Confederate state. Both Missouri and Kentucky had stars on the Confederate flag, even though neither state was officially or even arguably governed by Confederates. With such unruly but also important states, the neutrality of Kentucky and Missouri was a hard but crucial thing to maintain. For much of the war, this region was both the marching ground and battlefield of the conflict. Lincoln said once, near the beginning of the war, that he hoped to have God on my side, but that he must have Kentucky. This was for a number of reasons, most of them military. Kentucky and all of these border states had hundreds of thousands of young, military-aged men. If these men were for the Union, the war might be put to a quick end. However, if these men went to the Confederacy, it may very well mean the death of the Union. In fact, it was a little bit of both in the end. As many as 170,000 soldiers from these states were fighting for the Union, and some 86,000 were Confederate. Though these states made up only about 5% of the total land of the United States, including the Confederacy, it is where much of the fighting would be done, besides the main Confederate states and especially Virginia. This region was also one of the biggest in agriculture. Whoever controlled it would have food enough to feed all of their armies. All throughout the war, many Confederate armies were starving. Many unfortunate soldiers went hungry. Had they control of this region, that may not be a problem. Also, if the Union wanted to invade the South, and if the Confederacy would like to invade the Union and force our surrender, the armies would have to cross through these border states. This was doubly sensitive and frustrating because many of these states, in addition to their neutrality policies, also had policies that if any soldiers, Union or Confederate, were marching through the state, that people had the right to fight against them. Because of these states and their very, very special interests, as well as their importance all around, Abe Lincoln had to tiptoe around them much of the time. These states, all being slave states, also complicated things, and more than anything, it's the reason that the Emancipation Proclamation only freed slaves in the rebellious states, but not in these border states which remained loyal to the Union. These states were a huge handicap, but also a huge crutch to the Union. Had these border states not been slave states in the first place, or maybe had been less friendly with the South, the tone of the war on the Union side probably would have been anti-slavery from the very start. But instead, Lincoln had to always keep in mind the unique interests of these states, because the destiny of the Union was tied always with these few states. As the war raged on, the border area expanded beyond these 5 states into Tennessee after the state was recaptured by Union forces in early 1862, and to much of Virginia as Union armies worked towards and eventually into the Confederate capital of Richmond. Other states and regions are also sometimes considered part of this border region, such as Kansas, the Indian Territory, which is modern-day Oklahoma, and the New Mexico Territory, which are now the states of New Mexico and Arizona. Gentle as Lincoln was with these states and territories, they were at the brunt of much of the war. Many of the bloodiest battles happened here. Many cities in these states were leveled. The destructive forces of war were probably harshest here over many other Union states. More than just the normal destruction of war, too. These border states experienced plenty of guerrilla warfare. There were also assassinations, murder, and just general chaos much of the time. One particularly bloody event was the Lawrence Massacre, where over 150 non-military men and children were murdered. When the war was past and over with, this region technically didn't go through Reconstruction. Official Reconstruction only applied to those states which were fully Confederate. Having been some of the states worst hit by the war, they had much to reconstruct. When the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, the ban on slavery did not apply to these still slave states. But when the 13th Amendment passed, banning slavery everywhere in the U.S., these border states were not much effective. By this time, slavery had died out for the most part in these states, and it wasn't a very important issue for many of the people of these states. After the war, these states were fairly progressive, lagging behind the rest of the northern states, but they still made progress. But in the 1880s, after the Republican hold on the nation and Reconstruction ended, these states were won by Democrats. These Democrats did as Southern Democrats did, and they discriminated against free blacks. They segregated the whole of the states. However, unlike their Southern counterparts, they still allowed black men and later women to vote. Also, lynching wasn't as much of a problem in these states for the most part. When the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, every senator from a border state voted in favor, except for one from West Virginia. This region, though the fate of the nation is no longer depending on it, is still important today. I hope you enjoyed this video. It took a good long while to make. Good night.